Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Tansel Adacan. I'm the Global Systems Director at Landor, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that myself and my team worked on at Landor to basically modernize and upscale our infrastructure and our processes. So I've broken this presentation down into 7 sections. That's a little bit about Landor, what was the problem that we were trying to solve, why were we trying to solve this problem, how did we solve it, what were some of the issues that we faced along the way, what were the results, and then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. So a little bit about Landor. It was founded in 1941 by a guy called Walter Landor. He's actually one of the kind of pioneers of the branding industry, and some of the most iconic brands that you hear of today, such as Coca-Cola, Levi's, British Airways, Etihad, etc. He actually worked with them in bringing about their brand identity, as you see today. And we've got 25 offices across 19 countries, so a lot of different people from different regions to work with, which keeps it interesting. And as you can see, there's the picture of the Klamath boat, which you'll see kind of pasted a lot on a lot of our brochures and our branding and so forth. And basically the Klamath, it was a boat that Walter Landor, he took a risk to basically set up the headquarters of the company in San Francisco. I think it was 1964 till 1987. And it was a major success. He dealt with some big celebrities, people like Issey Miyake, and so on. So it's definitely got kind of ingrained in Landor's history as bring it up to where it is today. So Landor as a company, what do we do? Well, Landor helps companies to build agile brands. So in the past, brands have been quite rigid, they've been quite consistent, but obviously that's the old branding model that works. And in today's age, with things like innovation and the ever fast changing, how the industries are changing, brands need to be more agile. So Landor helps companies to do that. And as part of that, we've actually got a paradox here, because as a brand, you need to stay consistent, but you also need to continuously adapt. So it's the kind of countering each other. So Landor, they identified 6 behaviors that they work with on their clients. The first one being principled. So what does a brand stand for? And what's their message? Being adaptive. So a brand always needs to find new ways of expressing their message. They've got to be open, so they've got to be continuously communicating with their customers and their stakeholders. They've got to be responsible, so like their corporate social responsibility, working with taking care of the environment, the employees, and so forth. They've got to have a global view. So even if they're not a global brand, it's important that they think like a global brand, because nowadays you can be kind of taken out from any company or any region. And lastly, they've got to be multi-channel. So, they've got to be able to communicate at the right time, at the right place, on the right channel. And this is one of the main tools that Landor uses to map a brand. So they call it the experience wheel. So it really looks at the human side of a brand. So how does it look? How does it feel? How does it do? And how does it talk? And then they also look at the dream element as well, which is kind of looking beyond the present, like how will a brand evolve in the future? So what is the problem that Landor are trying to solve with upscaling and modernizing their digital asset management solution? So imagine you've got a business, a one-person business, and you're working with an end client. You're producing assets for that client, and you can be the most inefficient, most unorganized person ever. But because you don't have that much work with that client, it's still you can still maintain the work that you're doing for that client. But then what happens when the amount of projects that get released from that client increase? Or what happens when you start winning more clients? Or when you start growing more employees? Or as Landor, when you've got 25 offices worldwide, how do you manage all those assets? Because the amount of assets we're producing is growing, and the kind of the amount of space that they take up is ever increasing with things like rich, 4K. You've got more users and more formats as well. So, what are the first bucket of issues that we're trying to look at to resolve? I've kind of put it as the infrastructure, network, and application. Is aging servers. So, how many of you here today, let's say, have bought a computer, let's say, 15 years ago and still use it today? Raise your hands, please. You always get one, don't you? Or two? Okay. But in general, most of those computers, by this time, they most likely would have thrown the dreaded blue screen of death. And, because over time, computers deteriorate, just like servers. So eventually, they need to be replaced. So we need to find a way of kind of automating the replacement of these servers and to keep them forever robust. The second issue that we were trying to resolve is obviously hard disk drive storage space. So, with the amount of space being taken up ever increasing, how can we manage this? Like servers run out of space just like that, and then what happens? Your whole workflow production goes, and your studio just left. They can't work, they can't access the files, or they need to work on their local. So it's like we need to find a more efficient, a better way of doing this. The third thing being regular backup. So again, the old way of backing up is you've got your server guy, your server's running out of space, and they would kind of download your client files to a tape, and then they archive the tape, which is, it takes up a lot of time, and it's quite costly. And if you have, as landlord does, like contractual obligations with certain clients and so forth, sometimes they can come out of the blue and say, fetch me this asset from 8 or 10 years ago, from this project number with this client, with this client number and so forth. So again, with the old way, it can take quite a long time to retrieve those assets. So again, how do we find a way to speed that up? Data protection and contractual obligations, which have obviously just gone through, I'm sure you've all seen the ransomware issue that occurred where, it takes over your computer and you have to pay millions of pounds in Bitcoin. It's like we've got to protect ourselves against this. So how do we do that? And then future-proofing the solution as well. So when we roll out the dam, how can we ensure that we roll it out in such a way that we can easily upgrade it and that we can ensure that any customizations that we make to it don't break it? And the last thing being, obviously, reports and analytics. So when you're working off local file servers, it's quite hard to understand, how many assets you've got for certain clients, how many times they're being accessed, who's accessing them, and so forth. So we've got to, find better ways of generating and evaluating this data. So the second bucket that I've created here is accessibility and data management. And it's come up with effective metadata and catalog management. So again, with having 25 offices, each office, especially when they first start out, they kind of work in their own way. So they have their own metadata structure, they store data in a certain way and so forth. So it's like, we need to find a way of synchronizing this across the organization to ensure that everyone works in the same way. Better user experience in user interface. So I'm sure you've all experienced this. There's nothing worse than using a product that is slow or that is just ugly. And it decreases employee satisfaction. So it is an important element that we need to consider. Remote working on multiple devices and browsers. So as I'm sure you're all aware now, in this age, we don't always work from the office. We may be traveling, we may be working on client sites and so forth. So we need to have access instantly to our assets at any location on any device. And then office collaboration, repurposed brand assets. So again, with having loads of different offices, there's a higher likelihood that actually one office that's doing a certain piece of work is actually doing the same piece of work as another office. So first of all, we're doubling up on time, but then also how do we ensure that when we use assets, that when we upload them to the system, we're not duplicating those assets. And finally, previewing assets inside the DAM on a mouse server. So I suppose this is more like a feature thing. So, if you see loads of thumbnails on the screen, it's far more efficient to, hover the mouse over and see the actual picture itself rather than having to download it, open it, and so forth. So it's kind of reducing the amount of clicks in the DAM, and then converting the assets inside the DAM to multiple formats, so transcoding. Again, rather than having to go to a studio and say, oh, can you get this AI file and generate a JPEG or from a PSD? It's like giving a new business or client services and so forth the power to do this themselves. And lastly, establishing improved processes and procedures. So the first thing being versioning. Again, working on a file server, you end up creating multiple files with like different naming, with different names for the dates. So rather than having loads of files stored on one server, how can you automate this so that you can have just one file, but then you'd be able to access previous versions of that? DRM, legal and policies, a big thing, obviously, because all it takes is for a company to use one asset incorrectly that's either rights managed or that has a royalty attached to it, and you become liable for legal action. So we need to protect ourselves and we need to find better ways of doing this. And also on that point, actually, it's important because sometimes you may be working with a supplier or a client who claims that it's okay, but it might not necessarily be. So it's important for a company to be on top of this as well themselves. External sharing. So again, it's finding better ways to share files rather than put it in and dropping it in an email, especially if it's, we're talking gigabytes here, it's just not possible. So finding ways to share directly from a DAM system rather than downloading it to your local and sending it on an email. New, better ways of working. I see it myself in the studio. Sometimes, they don't always have the ideas or the inspiration that they need for a piece of work. So sometimes they need to do a bit of research and look at some of the work that they've done previously or even other competitors' work. So it's how do we find a way of setting up the DAM so that, let's say, if they work on a client and it's a coffee shop or something, that they can search assets on previous work for a coffee client that they did, so they can get some kind of idea of that work. Authorizations, approvals, and increased brand control for global brand consistency. Again, it's just making sure that you set up an authorization system so that we don't have junk uploaded into the DAM, that it is vetted. At the end of the day, it's important for, especially as a brand consultancy. And lastly, setting up global agreements. So again, when a company grows, you can have the issue where each office almost operates like separate businesses. They operate like separate entities. And sometimes they might even have agreements that you're not even aware of that they've set up. So it's like, how do we take all the agreements and unify them into one so that we get the best deal possible? So why are Landor doing this? Quite simple. It's, and I know this was mentioned earlier that we don't talk about this much, but things like cost and money. So, if you're doing the same work several times over, or, you're taking longer to work on assets, if it's taking longer to retrieve them and so forth, your costs go up because your efficiency is diminished. So if we drive up efficiency, we reduce costs. The time and speed to market. So again, the challenges of today is that, especially with the amount of competition there is, especially smaller companies working in a very agile way, how does a big global company compete with them? Because we need to keep up with them. We can't be clunky and rigid, or we're going to get trounced. So it's we've got to ensure that we're fast enough that we can actually even compete with the smaller companies. Adding value, doing more, so finding better ways of working, again, kind of related to the early example of, when they want to find inspiration for a piece of work, it kind of adds value to the organization. Legal protection, obviously, as part of our DRM strategy. Employee satisfaction, more satisfied employees means higher employee retention. So everything that we do to keep them satisfied is a plus. And finally, actually, it's a necessity. There's, as I said, there's a good saying that I've put here that even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. And it's totally true because, we need to always think ahead. We don't get too confident, too comfortable in ourselves that, we're the best and so forth, because eventually something will happen out of the blue and wham, we get hit. So always staying ahead of the game. So how did Landor solve the problem? Well, the first thing we did actually, and again, this relates to what was said earlier on about it's not just about the engine, we spoke to the end users of these products. So we actually got in touch with all the users from all the studios and understood how do they use it and what is their problem, what problems do they have, which is quite a, it's quite a tough task in itself to do. But it gave us loads of insights. We had studios, and it was quite interesting to hear this actually, because sometimes, like you don't necessarily know what's going on in the ground floor when you're sitting at a higher level. So, we found out that, for example, people secretly on the slide reverting to using Excel spreadsheets, for example, to track certain things because, it was faster and easier for them to do it. So we kind of gathered that information and documented it. And so then we mapped the existing and ideal process. So, we gathered all that information and we said, right, okay, this is a template process that we use across the organization, but obviously ensure that there's enough flexibility for local offices. And finally, we investigate and choose the right dam solution while involving multiple stakeholders. So, considering things like how long has the product been on market? Can it do what we want it to do? Do we have any relationships? Every recommendations? Is it global solution? And so forth. So the next thing we did, we built the infrastructure, the network, and we installed the application. Very big project. And as part of this, we actually utilized a third-party development partner who was specialists in the field. And I think that definitely helps. Even though we have developers in-house, sometimes it does help to get that extra expertise. So we set up, we actually use Amazon for this. I'm sure a lot of you know of the Amazon AWS service. So we set up EC2 instances with load balancing, meaning that, let's say if we serve a request, when we want to grab an asset and the server falls over, at least there's another server to continue managing those requests. Whereas if you only have one server managing all those requests, it falls over, you can't do any work basically. We set up multiple S3 buckets for different catalogs and an S3 connector, so that, for example, if we upload assets into the system, it goes directly to Amazon rather than to a local file server. We set up also a content delivery network, and I think this is important for speed of retrieval. So basically, in a nutshell, it is Amazon have this kind of infrastructure where when you upload an asset, it caches the asset according to local caching servers in local regions. So let's say, for example, and we have this issue in the past, I'm in the UK and I want to access an asset from San Francisco. The latency means that it takes a lot longer to do that. So by using the content delivery network, it actually says, this user is actually in Europe or in UK. Let's get it from a local server, from a local caching server there, and hence the speed of retrieval is a lot faster. I think one of the downsides there, though, is because it's caching. Sometimes if you update an asset, it can actually access the old asset still because it's not recached it. So it's just important to be aware there. We use Glacier storage for backups and snapshots. With S3, you have different grades of storage. So you have your standard, you have your standard infrequent access, and then Glacier. So obviously, the higher the grade storage, the higher the cost. So we use the higher storage for everyday assets. But then for your archives, we use Glacier, and it just helps to keep all of our costs down. Obviously, the kind of downfall there is if we want to access those assets, it takes slightly longer because it's a lower grade storage as well. Secure SSO and end-to-end encryption of data, so using unified credentials to access the DAM system rather than separate credentials per user. We use CloudWatch notifications, so again, we're all over this where we know if a server is under strain, we know straight away and we can act on it. And there's so many more things like auto upscaling, and I suppose just better ways to stay on top of your infrastructure. And then we made network changes and updates. So, when we set up the content delivery network, there was a lot of work involved there. I'm going to talk more about the challenges that we face there later on, especially working in a big kind of group of companies where we have to go through certain procedures and so forth to do that. And then migrating assets. So again, this was a huge job where we had terabytes of data to migrate. So it's like, what's the best way of migrating that? And after analysis, we found that actually we would use Amazon Snowball. So they basically send like, I think it's like a 50 terabyte hard disk drive to your local data center, and you can just basically, download everything to local, ship it off back to Amazon, and then they upload it into the S3 bucket. Because obviously, you've got 10 terabytes of data, and you're trying to upload it directly to Amazon, it's going to cost a fortune, and it's going to take forever. And finally, configure and customize the application. So we made sure that when we chose this solution, that it was actually one that we could focus on configuring rather than customizing it. So we did more just configuration rather than coding it. And I think that's important because the more you customize a solution with code, the higher likelihood it is to break in the future when you do things like version upgrades and so on. So we kind of thought with a future perspective in mind there. And lastly, we had a comms plan around our rollout. So, we as soon as we got definite dates confirmed, we then started making announcements and letting users know of the training and the go live dates. And then we trained users on how to use the application and the processes. And I think this is quite a challenge in itself because having 5 different regions, it's like, how are we going to do this? So we basically, kind of put CAPJ and Greater China in one kind of training session, and then North America and LATAM in another, and then EMEA is kind of, if it was at the start of your working day, then you'd be in the CAPJ and GC training sessions, and if it was at the end of your working day, you'd be at the NA and LATAM training sessions. So again, it can be quite confusing there because you have all the different time zones as well, so you have to kind of remember that as well, because all it takes for you to incorrectly kind of calculate a certain time zone, and you've messed up your training. So once we did that, and then obviously then it's posting all that content of the training, so we record the sessions and put it on our intranet called Land.net, which is also another transformation project we're working on. And then finally, go live. So, we've done all the training, we've done all the announcements, and then we've gone live. And of course, one of the key challenges here when going live with a product is even if you plan it the best, and you say we use the best solution, and and we have the best training, people are still going to ask questions. They still need their hand-holding, especially at the early stages of a rollout. So it's very, very important that, I'd say when we're going live, it's almost like we're just getting started, actually, because there are a lot of questions coming in, and we've got to make sure that we're there to help them. Because if we don't, and we just keep saying, read the documentation, they're just not going to use it, and the project will fail. So what could have been done better? So when we were migrating the assets to the Snowball device, actually the script kept on failing. And one of the reasons why was because of illegal characters. Some of the files were so old that they had like stars and hashtags and stuff like that in them. So it was, how do we resolve this? Because there were thousands of them, so we couldn't just go in there and change them manually. So literally, in the most agile way possible, we built a file naming utility tool that basically went through all the files and took out all the illegal characters from it. And actually now it's helping us on future projects as well. Next thing, network configuration. So this took longer than expected. Some of these points actually, some of them I suppose we could have anticipated better, and some of them are just difficult to anticipate. And with this one, as some of you may know, WPP is currently going through a transformation program, and we're being affected directly by that. So, when we do any network configuration, we now need to go through a service help desk, and it goes to IBM, and then WPP get involved, and so forth. And it sometimes we'd make the request, and the ticket would get lost in the ether, and we have to chase it. So, as a result, it took slightly longer, but we still got there in the end because we persisted. Reserved EC2 instance size. So again, trying to keep this at a high level, but with the instances at Amazon, you can either spin them up as on demand or you can spin them up as reserved. So if you spin them up as on demand, the beauty there is that you can open them and close them as and when you want. So you can be far more agile. But as a result, it costs more to do that. So a better way of keeping your costs low for this type of thing is to get reserved instances. Now, as part of this, I'd say we kind of undercalculated just how much kind of server power we'd need, and because we'd already reserved them in advance, you actually have a thing where you basically sell your server on a marketplace, on Amazon Marketplace, and then we had to repurchase it. So basically, although we still saved money than having a fully on-demand service, it still cost us a little bit more because we should have purchased a little bit more in advance. Asset references, so redirection of asset references to the server. I suppose that wasn't too much of an issue, but basically when we did migrate all of our assets to S3, it was then telling the application that, oh, the assets don't sit here anymore, they sit on the cloud, so we had to basically redirect them, but it wasn't as simple because there was certain metadata missing, and we had to do a bit more coding around that, but we got there in the end. Communication channels, and this, I'd say this is probably one of the toughest things, was that there was changes of teams on both sides. So I kind of came about a quarter way through this project already, so some of the requirements had been supposedly gathered, and some hadn't, and when it changed on both sides, the worst thing was when we're trying to, for example, we're trying to chase for something, and there's no one there because they're gone. And so it's like, who do we contact? So we're like having to try and contact the CEO of the company, for example, and it made it a less pleasant experience as a result. Again, the problem was on our side. Although that being said, in the end, we got to a happy medium, and now we've got a successful and fruitful relationship. And lastly, bugs in custom development. So, we built the SSO solution so that users can log in using unified credentials, but there were, again, because it's a custom solution, there was actually bugs in it, and I think two of the bugs was, one, as soon as you log in, it will kick you out, and two, as soon as you try and download an asset, it will kick you out as well. So, so it's like, how do we overcome this? And that was quite a challenge. But again, we persisted, and we got in there in the end. So finally, what were the results? I'll be honest, some of these we're still measuring because it's still quite the early stages. But just at a high-level overview, the beauty is now we have lifetime servers, so we're not going to have issues of servers becoming like kind of aging over time and then they fail and so forth, because they'll always be running, in theory, forever, unless we change them or we run out of money. Unlimited storage. Again, the beauty of S3 is we won't have any more of these hard disk drive space issues. We can upscale and downscale as we like. Regular backups. All automated. We don't get a server guy in anymore to archive them to tape. We do all the backups there. Although there's another thing that I didn't mention earlier on with contractual obligations is that for some assets we do have contractual obligations where you're not allowed to use certain cloud services, or you need to store them in a certain location because of obviously data protection, which I just covered. Future-proofing the solution. So the beauty is because we configured it and not customized it, we're in a good position to look at things like AR and VR. But at this stage, I'll be honest, and maybe this is just personal, but I think we're still early stage, and I think people get a bit excited about this future stuff rather than focusing on just getting things done or focusing on them now. And lastly, reports and analytics, and now we can basically, we can report on whatever we want. So how many assets we upload per client, how much storage, and so forth. Accessibility and data management, again, effective metadata, so everything's all streamlined across the organization. There is still some kind of inconsistencies. Nothing's ever going to be 100% perfect, but we're working on it. Better user experience and user interface, so it's nice and clean. We've got it's like a white kind of background with tiles in it rather than like a file server or some old IT system. Remote working on multiple devices and browsers, again, seamless. So we've got a mobile application as well that we use as part of our, agreement, as well as we can use the actual browser. Office collaboration, repurposed brand assets. So, if we upload an asset into the DAM system, it will actually know if there's a duplicate. So it will tell us and that way we avoid that duplication. We can preview assets inside the DAM on the mouse over, so we save time. And lastly, converting assets inside the DAM to improve multiple formats. So basically, we've done what we said we were going to set out to do. And finally, just going through versioning, DRM, external sharing, new and better ways of working. We don't have those issues anymore. And authorizations, approvals. So we have like different levels now, so that I suppose we just make sure that we maintain brand consistency across the organization. And setting up global agreements. So we're not quite there yet, but we know the agreements that we've got now. So, with all of your stock libraries, we know who the local account managers are now. So we're in the process of getting that set up for further improvements. Because at the end of the day, one of the things with these kind of projects is, even though if you roll them out and you do a transformation, you then have phases after that. It's always an ongoing process. So, there we go. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.